Thank you everyone for joining. We will get started now. We are recording this meeting and it will be posted on our YouTube channel, hopefully tomorrow. Welcome to the Mass Pollinator Network's July meeting. We are going to hear from Todd Bittner, Director of Natural Areas for the Cornell Botanic Gardens. First, a few reminders, and I'm going to drop links for these reminders I'm telling you about in the chat, but I don't want to take up any time that Todd could be talking to us. So our next brown bag lunch is Wednesday, August 7th. Starting at noon, runs till 1. You are welcome to come and go as you please. Drop in with questions or to hear other pollinator advocates talk about a project you're working on, or just kind of anything that comes to mind. They're always very interesting conversations. Also, we will not be having an August monthly meeting. But our next one, so get outside and enjoy your yards. Our next one will be Tuesday, September 24th, and it will be Our Future with Water with Trevor Smith of Weston Nurseries. So I hope you can come for that. And now I'm going to introduce Todd. Todd Bittner is the Director of Natural Areas for the Cornell Botanic Gardens. The garden's Natural Areas program protects and manages a system of preserves spanning nearly 3,700 acres across 40 natural areas. The preserves encompass 1/3 of Cornell's iconic campus landscape, including 2 massive gorges, scenic Beebe Lake, and a renowned wildflower garden, which hosts the garden's native lawn that was featured in the New York Times article of 2023. Todd leads the protection and stewardship of these lands and the garden's native biodiversity conservation efforts. He also directly educates students and the public on natural heritage topics and is a lecturer in the School of Plant Science. Todd is also a conservation scientist with the Center for Plant Conservation, and in 2020 was named a conservation champion by the center. And I am going to welcome Todd in just a second, but if you have questions while he is speaking, please put them in the chat. He also will leave time for Q&A afterwards, but unless it's something like completely timely, and there's just something super important, just put it in the chat and we will get to it at the end. I will be monitoring the chat, so if you have any technical questions, I can hopefully answer those as well. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Todd.
Thank you so much, Renee, for the introduction. I'm happy to be here and looking forward to sharing about the Cornell Botanic Gardens native lawn. So I'd like to start my presentation as I would if I were out in the field, where I bring people out to the native lawn, but first I have them stand next to the native lawn in a turf grass lawn, the traditional turf grass lawn, and I ask people where they are, and they say, at the Cornell Botanic Gardens in Ithaca, New York, on Cornell's campus. And I say, no, you are in Eurasia. Look where your feet are, what the plants are, where they come from. They're all from Europe and Asia. Now, walk across the path, step over here, and then I lead them into the native lawn, and I ask them where they are, and it's, now you're in New York. This is the New York flora, and it's very similar to the great Wendell Berry, who introduced us to this sense of place, and we've lost that in understanding our native biodiversity, our native flora. It helps ground us and helps to provide where each area is unique and special. And that really drives more than just the geology, the geography of a particular area, but it's a sense of place that's also about our time in place, our time in history, and we're in this really crucial moment where as agents of change, it's really up to us to try to save the biodiversity in our areas, as many others are working in other areas as well. And we think that the native lawn is a good way to do that. Now, of course, working on protecting pollinators is equally worthy, and there's a great overlap, which is why I'm happy to be here to present today. So lawns are a dominant landscape type in the United States. Traditional monoculture turf lawns account for approximately 2% of the land in the United States. That may not sound like much, but it adds up to approximately 40 million acres, or simply the equivalent to the state of Wisconsin. Maintaining the traditional lawn is labor intensive, is polluting, consumes huge amounts of water, and provides little to no benefit for wildlife. Traditional turf lawns also require significant amounts of energy to create and maintain. Nitrogen fertilizer is a leading polluter of our waterways, where excessive application and runoff promotes algal blooms. These blooms eventually decompose, promoting anoxic conditions and starving freshwater life of essential oxygen. Excess nitrogen also plays a role in promoting and increasing the toxicity of harmful algal blooms. Many pesticides are also very polluting, as you all know, and can be acutely toxic to fish, birds, and pollinators. In the US, a staggering 90 million tons of pesticides and fertilizers are applied to lawns annually. Traditional lawns are also a huge time and water suck. The average American spends about 70 hours a year on lawn and garden care. Given that many people don't have yards, particularly in urban areas, this means the time spent is likely significantly higher. Lawns also require significant amounts of fresh water to maintain, particularly in more arid regions. American lawns take up an area 3 times larger than that of any other irrigated crop in the country. And if that isn't bad enough, lawnmowers account for 5% of the nation's air pollution. Turf mowing consumes over 800 million gallons of gasoline annually, resulting in 7.1 million tons of CO2 emissions. That is greater than what the entire state of Vermont emits. Measured another way, in just 1 hour, a lawnmower produces as much air pollution as driving a car 100 miles. Given the climate crisis we are facing, reducing emissions across all sectors, including in our homes and yards, is essential. And lastly, traditional lawns are composed of non-native grasses and non-native spontaneous weeds that are originally from Europe and Asia and offer limited quality habitat to native birds and insects. In short, we need to ditch our traditional turf lawns. To help change this paradigm and provide a viable alternative, the Botanic Gardens embarked on an ambitious project to create a native plant-dominated lawn. This native lawn demonstration project aimed to create a shift in how we design and landscape our homes, public green spaces, and ultimately to advance sustainability itself. This project converted a non-native grass and weed lawn to a low-maintenance, low-energy input, and high biodiversity sustainable native lawn. Our goals were simple. We wanted to maintain or even enhance the traditional aesthetics of a turf lawn. We wanted it to be able to tolerate a moderate amount of trampling and wanted to eliminate watering, fertilizer, and pesticide inputs post-establishment. We also wanted the lawn to require only minimal hand weeding after the first 2 to 3 years. We also wanted to significantly curtail carbon dioxide emissions by only mowing it once or twice a year. 2 primary measures of success were if it consisted of at least 85% native plant cover and increased the overall biodiversity of pollinators and other fauna. Our project was inspired by Danthonia species, or commonly known as oat grasses. Chrissy Boyes, a now retired Botanic Gardens horticulturalist, is credited with the inspiration for the native lawn. Chrissy fell in love with Danthonia the moment she met it, growing along an old seasonal road. She then found it under power line cuts, in old, well-established city parks and cemeteries, all places with light levels of disturbance that it seemed to favor. Many of these areas appeared similar to traditional lawns, but with native New York species rather than typical Eurasian ones. The combination of native species and the lawn aesthetic provided the inspiration for creating the native lawn. And what these areas all had in common was that the disturbance that they received was enough to keep the areas sunny or partially sunny, but light enough disturbance to not be detrimental to many native plants. Locally in the Northeast, we have both Danthonia spicata and Danthonia compressa, which are both widely distributed, with compressa growing in the eastern third of North America and spicata growing in nearly every state in Canadian province. And as you can see from the distribution maps, both occur in Massachusetts. Each are low-growing, cool season or C3 grasses that are highly drought adapted. Mature plant heights have basal leaves up to 10 inches tall and flower stalks up to 24 inches high. We also found inspiration in the New York alvars or limestone pavement barrens, plant communities such as this one in the Nature Conservancy Shomoan Barrens Preserve in Jefferson County that help to inform our overall plant palette. Our project needed a home, and we selected an existing turf area within the Botanic Gardens Lindy Wildflower Garden here at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. Here's an early spring 2007 photograph of our project site. We intentionally selected a location with a slight south aspect at less than a 3% grade to help make the site slightly drier. The uphill side is bounded by a native perennial planting and the southern edge by a roadside and shallow ditch. We then developed an overall work plan and schedule. Site preparation began in 2008 in the early fall with a glyphosate application to the turf, followed by the removal of sod with small equipment. We then amended the clay loam soil with 2 inches of sand lightly incorporated into the site. Xanthonia and other native graminoid-informed seeds were collected locally under power line cuts, in old cemeteries, old road beds, and adjacent fields. Seeds were then cleaned using a brush machine and clipper cleaners to remove awns. Seeds to be broadcast were mixed with sawdust and were cold moist stratified for 60 days. Seeds for propagation were sown in February in 10 by 20 inch flats with a cold moist stratification of 40 degrees for 60 days in a commercial pro mix. The Xanthonia were also grown in pots with a mix of expanded shale and all-purpose peat. We developed a schematic planting design that included some experimental variables. These included 2 different seeding rates for seeds only plantings and a section with plug only planting. So here you can see the site plan with our Xanthonia spicata and compressa, plugs marked out, the 2x seeding rate and the single seeding rate that's kind of in the center. We also designed in some elements for some specialty plants. These included moss phlox, Phlox subulata, bluets, Houstonia caerulea, and pussy toes, Antenaria neglecta and Antenaria plantaginifolia. These species are all low growing and provide additional diversity, interest, and color. In all, we planted 8 grasses and sedges that met our criteria of being native, low growing, and drought adapted. Beyond Xanthonia, these included 3 carices, Carex eburnia, Carex pennsylvanica, and Carex tonsa, Agrasta scabra, ticklegrass, and little bluestem Schizocarium scoparium. Of these 8, all persisted and remain today, except for one, Poa alsoides, or woodland bluegrass. And we think our site was too sunny for that one to be happy. We selected 9 forbs that also met our criteria of being native, low growing, drought adapted, and of value for pollinators or other insects. The eastern prickly pear cactus, which yes, is native to parts of New York, was planted for a bit of whimsy for visitors, and unlike the rest of the native lawn, is not advised to be walked on. The forb species included 2 species of Antenaria, Houstonia caerulea, bluets, Penstemon hirsutus, beard's tongue, and Cicerentium angustifolium, blue-eyed grass. We also later added Fragaria virginiana, wild strawberry, and harebell, Campanula rotundifolia. All but 3 species established and remain today, while Aquilegia canadensis or columbine, Geranium maculatum, wild geranium, and Houstonia caerulea, bluets, did not persist. As part of our establishment trial, we tested 2 seeding rates to determine if there would be any success differences long-term. While the recommended seeding rate was between 1,000 to 3,000 seeds per square foot, our seed supply was limited, so one zone was planted at 660 seeds per square foot and the second zone at 1,400 seeds per square foot. The seeds were sown in mid-April to early May 2009 and then watered in for good soil and seed contact. We had good initial germination for all seeding rates and good establishment for within the first 2 months. Long term, we found no significant differences in cover based on the different seeding rates or the plug design. By May of that same year, our seedlings that were started in the greenhouse were ready to be transplanted for our plug treatment trials. This included the Danthonia spicata individuals that were grown in an expanded shale mix. The seedlings were then outplanted and watered as needed in the first year to promote establishment. The lawn was filling in well by the following April, but gaps remained between the planted plugs. The planted plugs can be seen here on the left side of the screen by the path, and the higher density seeding rates is in the center and over to the right. But by June, the lawn was filling in very well. That July, we had a bit of a setback and confirmed a fungus outbreak that set back some of the Danthonia population. This was located in the high seeding rate section, and we suspected that the intense competition there made it very warm and wet and humid, and promoted the fungus outbreak in that more densely planted area. We did end up treating the outbreak successfully with a fungicide and had good seedling recruitment of Danthonia spicata later that year. This was the only time that we had to use a fungicide on the project. Our only herbicide use was a small experimental glyphosate treatment on the Kentucky bluegrass that was unsuccessful and given up on. By the fall of that year, the area with the fungal outbreak had nearly fully recovered. The following season had a good crop of Danthonia seeds, so we opted to delay our typical mowing to allow for seed harvest for additional expansion the following year. Post-establishment, our typical mowing regime is to cut the area in early June and again in late August or September at 6 to 8 inches high to promote the short stature fall flowering forms. We now mow the lawn using a scythe, so the lawn now has zero carbon emissions. And actually, since I wrote that, we mowed it with this really cool hedge trimmer that's electric on an articulating stick. And so we can spot mow with it, and it's a lot more precise and clean than like using an electric weed whacker. For site preparation for the second phase, the area had been sprayed with glyphosate and scraped in 2009, and then planted with native grasses as a placeholder. We then opted to use a weed barrier fabric to solarize the cover crop and weeds and eliminate competing vegetation in the fall of 2011. For the soil amendment in phase 2, we opted to test using 2 inches of stone dust rather than sand to amend the clay loam soil, increase drainage, and determine if that more locally sourced material would be equally effective as an amendment. We tried to copy the seeding rates from the 2009 planting, but unfortunately had to reduce the rate by about 50% due to lack of seeds. We planted the site in late June of 2012 and covered it with remay fabric as a shade structure, as that spring and early summer were quite hot and dry. We did have to do some hand weeding, particularly during the first 2 establishment years for both respective phases. For example, we tried to limit non-native species such as white clover, trifolium repens. Although it's a great pollinator plant, and we love to promote it in traditional turfgrass lawns, as a legume, we wanted to limit it fixing and adding nitrogen to the soil and become a dominant species. We also continue to selectively hand-weed invasive species such as thistles and woody seedlings. Today, we spend significantly less time weeding than we would be mowing if it were still turf, and estimate that we spend less than 5 hours per year for maintenance presently. Now we'd like to highlight some of the native lawn species and share some details on each. Here we have hairy beard's tongue, Penstemon hirsutus, which is a great midsummer pollinator plant that does tolerate mowing well. The lovely bluets, Houstonia caerulea, that did very well early on, unfortunately did not persist for more than 3 years. We suspect that it didn't fare well under the intense interspecific competition that developed as the native lawn grew in. Moss phlox, Phlox subulata, also did very well early on, but waned in later years. The white inflorescences shown here in a spring 2013 photo are from 2 species of pussy toes, Antenaria neglecta and Antenaria plantaginifolia. As many native systems, the plant community and its appearance changes over the course of the year. Here's a close-up of the pussy toes basal leaves with a very low growing profile forming nearly a carpet. We also included Carex pennsylvanica or Pennsylvania sedge. This is a very common open woodland species found in dry oak forest that also grows rhizomatously, which is a nice characteristic for a lawn species to have. Unfortunately, it's difficult to start from seed, so this was introduced vegetatively from vegetatively propagated material. Another sedge species that we include is Carex tonsa or shaved sedge, shown in the middle there. Wild strawberry, Fragaria virginiana, was introduced a few years into the study and did very well in the native lawn. This is a species that can also grow well in traditional turf lawns if introduced and allowed to grow in a pesticide-free lawn. It's great for wildlife. The berries are eaten by all kinds of mammals, and it's a great plant supporting insect communities. Here's a summer photograph of the 2 Danthonia species, Spicata and Compressa, showing their flowering culms and spikelets. Gives you a good sense of the 8 to 10 inch high vegetative basal leaves, growth form, and then the wispy, very open inflorescences that are about twice that tall. Danthonia leaves naturally grow only to 10 to 12 inches high with flowering culms up to the 2 feet if not mowed. I also think that they're really attractive with how they curl up and their tips tinged with brown. It's much more interesting growth form than many other grasses. We also had a number of native species seeded in from the adjoining native landscape gardens that added diversity to the native lawn. For forbs and woody plants, we had 33 native species that established spontaneously as of 2022. This included a number of fall flowering asters, including Symphiatricum cordifolium or heart-leaved blue aster, Symphiatricum levi or smooth blue aster, which is highly drought tolerant, and Symphiatricum prenanthioides or bushy aster, which prefers a bit more moisture and shade. We also had a number of violet species that thrived in the native lawn, including Viola sagittata, arrowleaf violet, Viola palmata, wood violet, and Viola sororia, common blue violet. As the name implies, this species is common, grows readily from seed, and can persist in traditional turf lawns if they're not mowed too short, and are managed without pesticides. And lastly, another attractive and excellent pollinator species is great blue lobelia, Lobelia syphilitica. For non-native species, we had 6 grasses that established spontaneously in the lawn. Not surprisingly, we had some Kentucky bluegrass that has crept in, but it was only in low densities. We've had 2 species of agrostis appear, which are also low growing and attractive. Also appearing spontaneously is Anthoxanthum odoratum, or sweet vernal grass, which acts much like Danthonia and could be a surrogate species if you're willing to consider non-native species in a lawn. And for non-native forbs and woody plants, we have identified 21 species that appeared spontaneously in the trial. These included several typical turf weeds, such as chickweed, black medic, plantain, self-heal, and dandelion. We also had several common weeds of old fields and roadsides, such as Queen Anne's lace, hawkweed, and common St. John's wort. For invasive non-native species, we had Canadian thistle and multiflora rose. That said, overall, the non-native species remained at low densities. You may recall we originally set the performance goal to have 85% native plant cover. To test this, we surveyed the native lawn in July 2022 to determine the cover of Danthonia species and other native species, non-native species, bare ground, and litter, and assess that for both the sand treatment and the stone dust treatments. Overall, we met the goal of 85% native cover in the sand treatment, and we're close for the stone dust treatment at 80% native cover. Danthonia fared better in the sand treatment with 12% cover overall, while it was only half that in the stone dust. The cover of non-native species was higher in the stone dust at 20%, while being only 13% in the sand treatment. We speculate that some of these differences may be due to differences in pH between the soil amendments, with more calcareous stone dust amended soil having a pH of 8.2 and the more acidic sand treatment with a lower pH at 7.6. The lower seeding rate for the 2012 stone dust planting may have also affected the outcome. Another measure of success for the native lawn was to see an increase in biodiversity for wildlife insects. To test this, we sampled the insect community in 2023 in the native lawn and within a nearby traditional lawn. Here at Cornell Botanic Garden, student interns are sampling the lawn just prior to its first mowing of the season in mid-July, and our sampled traditional turf lawn can be seen in the background. What we found from the surveys was that the native lawn yielded nearly 4 times as many insect families represented versus traditional lawns, with 36 families documented in the lawn in just 1 day of sampling. But the difference was not just in the totals, but that there was a higher complexity in the diversity of niche roles the insects represented in the native lawn, from herbivores to predators and even parasitoids. While in the turf lawn, it was mostly detritivores and herbivores. So much simpler. Another goal was to have the native lawn meet or exceed expectations for aesthetics. Even though it is a subjective trait, and I'm certainly biased, I think we definitely met that mark, not just in one season, like in this early spring photo, but also continuing through the seasons. Here's an early summer photo. It also remained greener than the traditional turf lawn when we had a major drought in 2016, while the turf lawns were totally brown and we didn't water. Here's an early autumn photo of the native lawn. Even in the winter, the native lawn's winter plumage has various hues and structures of interest. And the added duff layer helps insulate the ground and overwintering insect community. So in large part, we think we met the aesthetic goals we set, not only for the growing season, but for year round. So by all measures, we have met our original goals: aesthetics, trampling, infrequent mowing, no fertilizer, no watering. We principally met the no pesticide goal except for the one-time use of a fungicide and the experimental glyphosate treatment on Kentucky bluegrass. We also observed 4 times as many insect families in the native lawn. And now that the lawn is in maintenance mode, we also spend very little time hand weeding, with only a few hours spent annually, and have 0 carbon emissions. And we have a diverse, resilient lawn consisting of over 85% native plant cover that presently consists of 55 native species. As for future directions, we're collaborating with university researchers to determine the carbon sequestration differences between traditional turf, low-mow turf, and the native lawn. Beyond the carbon savings from the reduced mowing, we expect many of these deep-rooted species will sequester substantially more carbon than other lawns. We're also collaborating on a below-ground invertebrate study to compare species composition with traditional lawns and low-mow lawns. So now scaling up. I'm sure many of you have originally heard about our native lawn in the New York Times feature article by Margaret Roach that ran in September 2023. The article was meant to help promote the native lawn and get people to think about alternatives to traditional turf. But it was also intended to help create demand in the marketplace for native plant materials. There is this interesting chicken and the egg dilemma where native plant nurseries won't carry certain plant species unless there's a clear public demand for them. And on the flip side, the public demand won't happen unless people know about and value these species and their uses. So given the response that the article generated, we now know that the public demand is there for the native lawn and now need to channel that information into commercial nurseries to grow the seed. This is where a new partnership we're involved with called the Northeast Native Seed Network comes in. Cornell Botanic Gardens and other partners, including commercial nurseries, are working to expand commercial availability of locally sourced, locally adapted native plant seed for habitat restoration and native lawns, and Danthonius bicata is part of this initiative. And longer term, through this network, we hope to be able to provide commercially available native lawn seed mixes or even native lawn sod for sale. In the meantime, there are a few commercial nurseries that we know of who are producing Danthonia currently, though you should expect that the original source is within their respective states. These nurseries include Pinelands in New Jersey, Prairie Moon in Minnesota, Hamilton Native Outpost in Missouri, and Everwild in California. And if anyone here in the Pollinator Network is aware of another commercial source, I would love to know that. So please share that information with me so that I can update our website and my presentation for the public's benefit. We are also working on developing what we're currently calling Native Lawn 2.0, where we aim to create a new mix of species that incorporates our lessons learned from our original native lawn, including planting many of the desirable species that grew spontaneously in the first one. We started this project this past spring. We're also tracking the time and cost involved with each step, as we recognize that individuals will want to know more about upfront costs and when the return on the investment can be realized and reduce maintenance costs long term. And I say that because I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but having a promotion, getting people to accept the native lawn and want to do the right thing that costs a lot of money is a big barrier. But if you understand that it actually will save you money in the long term, that upfront cost is minimized and we can get a lot more adoption. We are anticipating that our break-even cost will be somewhere around 3 to 4 years, but we need to test that and actually have the data to back it up rather than us just speculating about it. If you are thinking about mowing a lawn forever and the time that's involved with that and the cost that's involved with that, and you know that it will become significantly less to almost nothing after 3 or 4 years, that's a really compelling additional argument for people to become adopters of the native lawn beyond all the environmental benefits that it provides. So this new trial includes working to develop the lawn without removal of sod, which we recognize may be one of the largest obstacles to large-scale implementation. And given all the steps involved, we plan to create a how-to video that follows across the design to construction to early establishment phases. We hope to pull all this information together and update our native lawn website page found on cornellbotanicgardens.org to aid everyone in helping you create your own native lawn. I don't know when we'll be finished with all of that. Hopefully sometime next year, but we don't have a firm date yet on when that information will be publicly available. So while we work to build capacity and the tools to enable you to grow a native lawn, there are steps that you can take today to help address the climate crisis and give nature a helping hand in your present backyard. And I know I'm already preaching to the choir on this one. The first is to change your mowing regimes. Mow higher and less often. It's actually healthier for your lawn if it's mowed higher. Convert to an electric mower powered by renewables. This includes switching from those irritating CO2 emitting leaf blowers. They're my nemesis, so get rid of them. Get a battery powered one. Say no to fertilizers. Commercial companies market fertilizers to promote lawn health, but established lawns don't need it, and most of it ends up polluting our waterways. Plus, it means you have to mow more often and pay for it. So it's really quite a con. Next is to go organic and stop using pesticides. Embrace diversity in your lawn. The extra turf height and competition from species like violets and strawberries help reduce undesirable species like dandelions. You can also embrace other lawn alternatives like clover lawns, which often can include many additional desirable pollinator-friendly species. And finally, you can start to shrink your turf lawn intentionally by converting less used portions to native landscaping, to pollinator gardens, to rain gardens, or even stop mowing and allowing portions to succeed to meadow. So this is where I get up on my soapbox and talk about environmental agency. So the climate crisis can really be a depressing thing that we're all grappling with. And it seems that things are dire at times, but one of the things that we have the ability to do is to manage our own landscapes. And it provides agency for people that they can actually make a difference. Because if we work collectively towards that, all of those cumulative efforts start to pay off. And there's a huge groundswell of folks that are realizing this, realizing that the planet's health is in jeopardy, and doing things like the Massachusetts Pollinator Network is doing across the state is fantastic. We all work at different scales, and we can be working in our backyards as well. So we can implement some of these practices, whether it's a native lawn or changing our mowing or fertilizer, pesticide regimes, traditional turf alternatives, native landscaping that benefits pollinators. Those are all things that we can collectively be doing to make this difference. So whether you decide to take small steps or a big native lawn leap, we are optimistic that collectively we can help shape and drive a new environmentally responsible lawn paradigm. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Todd. That was awesome. We have quite a few questions already. Would you like me to read them out, or would you rather read them?
Sure, yeah, if you want to moderate, that would be great.
Sure. Yes. Okay, our first question is, have you considered introducing wood betony? It's a semi-parasitic flower that can open up space among native grasses. It's also good for bumblebees. Maybe that might make room for the Housatonia to return.
I love betony. You have to make sure that you have the right host plant in the area for it to do well. So if you don't, and I think it's oak, but you could correct me if I'm wrong. It may provide that kind of opportunity, but what we actually have done, and I didn't include it in our slideshow, is we created a different kind of soil amendment based on expanded shale. And I mentioned that a couple times, and I'll go in a little bit into more detail about it, but expanded shale is a commercially available product, and it's very similar to our native sandstone bedrock that we have around Ithaca. And so we essentially have created these little rock gardens within the native lawn, and the expanded shale has a lot less organics in it. It's much more xeric, and some of these species that don't do well with a lot of competition do well in the expanded shale. And so rather than the wood betony route, which could be a possibility, One of the ways to provide some of those species that have less competitive ability, you could do it through expanded shale, different kind of a planting media.
Thank you. Let's see. Our next question is, economically, is it better to start a small home lawn from seed or with plugs? Some garden places only sell plugs and not seeds.
Yes. So I'll say that there's advantages and disadvantages. When we did our original trial, that was part of the question that we wanted to answer. Plugs are very much more expensive. So that's the downside to them, but it jumpstarts your lawn faster. So that's a positive for them. But the density at which you plant them leaves a lot of gaps in between for the weeds to establish or just to grow. So there's trade-offs with that. And when we did it from seed, everything was 3 years later pretty much uniform. So we concluded, why not do the cheaper alternative? But if the cheaper alternative isn't commercially available, then it makes a lot of sense to do it with plugs. Just understand it's going to be more expensive, and you have to put more effort into trying to limit the non-natives from establishing in between the plugs because the spacing is so much different.
Can you describe how much trampling the lawn can take?
It got a lot of trampling in September of 2023 after the New York Times article came out. So, I mean, we have people walking in it regularly, and we have classes that the kids will come out and they'll sit in the native lawn for the class. So we put it down as moderate trampling. I personally wouldn't put it in, the main thoroughfares between like your house and, your garage or your mailbox or that kind of thing. But most of people's lawns isn't used for much, and it can tolerate that level of trampling.
Is it possible to convert a traditional lawn without killing the non-natives that are already there?
That's a good question. I think it would be very difficult. And that's because you will let me take it a different way. The design of the native lawn, even though it was a quote unquote design native plant community, it was not itself found in that assemblage of plants in nature, naturally. We kind of pulled all these together because these plants all had similar traits. But the way that plant community starts and develops over time is based on ecological principles, restoration ecology, plant community ecology, and those principles are there regardless of whatever the plant community is. So where I'm going with this is plant competition and plant succession. So when the slate is wiped clean and you get to be the first to establish, you have a huge advantage over anybody that comes later. And that's part of the reason we wanted to start from scratch when it came to the native lawn. And now that our native lawn is established and this tight matrix of native plants is fairly resilient to other non-native species that want to show up by seed or however to then get established. So if you want to try to establish a native lawn in a turf lawn without doing anything, it's almost the opposite of that. Here's all this dense competition from Kentucky bluegrass and plantain and dandelions, and your native seeds have to compete for water, light, nutrients as a little seedling this big against a giant dandelion or plantain that's not going to let you get established. So I think there would be very poor success unless you had the site preparation component. And that's part of what we're testing right now. And I didn't go into the detail about it, but the 3 treatments of the native lawn 2.0. One is sod removal, because we think that that's the best. That's the proven one in the first trial that worked. And part of what do we get out of that is you remove the organics, and our native plants do better where there is poor soil. I mean, the name Xanthonia is poverty oats grass, poverty being the soil is impoverished. And so taking away that rich organic soil in most of our traditional turfgrass lawns favors the native plants and disfavors the non-native plants. So we're trying to tip the scale towards what helps the native plants. The sod removal takes away some of the seed bank of those non-native species. And but the downside to it is it's a lot of work. It's the most cost effective. So everything has trade-offs. The herbicide treatment that we're doing, and I'm not a proponent of this. We actually are doing it because it's the cheapest, and we think it'll do the worst. But it's a test, so we want to know these things. Yes, it'll kill the plants. It leaves the seed bank intact. It leaves the organics intact. And so we think our native lawn will do worse in that. And then the upfront cost will be the lowest, but the maintenance cost for it will be the highest because it's going to have a bunch of things in it that we don't like. And the intermediate one is black fabric. And I showed an example of that in our 2012 native lawn, which is basically just landscape fabric that you put down on the ground and it solarizes the site. It kills the native vegetation or the turf grass vegetation, and it's pesticide free, although there's the microplastics and everything in plastic part of it. It should kill some of the seed bank, but not all of it, and it'll leave the organic there. And we think it'll be somewhere in the middle cost wise. So we're kind of looking at all of these with these pros and cons, to be able to determine the level of effectiveness among all these different measures, including the economic piece. But we didn't want to try and do the turf, no treatment and just seed into a turf, because we're pretty confident that that would be zero success and just a waste of our seeds.
How has the native lawn affected bird population? Also, how did the opuntia do in the native lawn?
The opuntia is still there. It's very happy. It flowers. We have it tucked up against a rock, so it's easier for people to see and not step on. The area isn't really big enough to do a full-on bird survey to know what birds are using it versus just the entire wildflower garden. So the Botanic Gardens is 700 acres on campus. The wildflower garden itself is 35 acres, and the native lawn is about a quarter. So it's really not practical for us to tease out the site specific differences that the native lawn would have on birds. So that's one of the reasons that we measured insects, because that's more at scale for this sized area as a wildlife indicator.
Can you suggest low ground covers for deep shade lawn?
The Norcross Wildlife Foundation up in Massachusetts is working on some of those things, and one of their top species was strawberry, and we have that in our native lawn. It can grow in sun and it can grow in shade, but that's an excellent one for shade. Poa alsoides, which we put in our original native lawn that didn't persist, probably would do well in a really shaded condition as well. And all of those asters that I mentioned can grow in shade. I mean, what happened for a lot of those species, you see in I stopped screen share. Let me do a quick screen share again here. So here we're looking at the native lawn again, and just beyond the crest of that hill is the rest of the wildflower garden and all of these woodland beds. And the seeds from those areas made their way into the native lawn and started to grow spontaneously. So those things grow both in these sunny conditions as well as in the shaded conditions, and they all perform very well. And the interesting thing about, some people might be familiar with those and be like, well, they can grow to be like 2 or 3 feet tall. So when we go in there and mow in September, they're only like about 12 inches, 14, 16 inches. And we mow them, and then rather than grow up, they grow out. And then they put additional flowers out, and they maintain this kind of bonsai condition to them. So just with that kind of simple mowing regime, we've adapted these beautiful species that can do well in this, again, light disturbance kind of light episodic, light intensity, not light sunlight conditions.
And everyone, feel free to raise your hand and actually ask a question if you would like. I'm happy to call on you. You do not have to just put them in the chat. We have one more in the chat. Could you use paper or cardboard to solarize instead of plastic?
So one of the differences advantages of black plastic is the black and the actual heat that is created. And so, yes, you can kill any vegetation with cardboard or paper, but that's as far as it goes. The cardboard actually insulates the ground some, and that heat doesn't get down there. We're trying to have that heat penetrate into that top layer of the seeds that are all weed seeds that are ready to start growing as soon as you take that black plastic off, or as soon as you take that cardboard off. So, so that would just be a difference, that you would expect you would have more non-native species coming out of the seed bank if you use cardboard versus black plastic.
Any other questions? Oh, let's see. We have a comment. What a fantastic experiment. So glad you are collecting data, including on expenses. This will inspire many native lawns. Great presentation too, and thank you.
I have a question.
Oh, great. Go ahead. Yes.
You mentioned black plastic. You also mentioned black fabric. Which is it? Because
it is black landscape fabric. It's polyethylene that's kind of woven together.
Yeah, it's not black plastic.
Yeah, but you could use plastic if you wanted. It's just that can get punctured much more easily than the fabric.
Okay.
How do you think actual like black cotton cloth would get hot enough and work?
Some of the plants might be able to grow through that.
Yeah.
I mean, it might be some kind of intermediary thing, but yeah, I mean, in all honesty, our top recommendation is to scrape the sod away, and that, we think, even though it has a higher upfront cost, is superior to the others. The other thing that happens, and we've already kind of seen this with our experiment, is that you don't get the same soil to seed contact when you are trying to seed into duff. And in the herbicided area, there's still a duff layer left. In the area that you would cover with fabric, there'd still be a duff layer. And it's really key to get the soil down into the, to get in good contact with the soil and seed to be able to promote germination.
We have a couple more questions. Is the native lawn rabbit resistant?
Um, no, we have little bunnies out there, and we don't have a bunny problem, so I'm kind of happy to see them there. Um, you know, some of the things that we have that they like clovers, I'm happy to have them eat those. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. And actually, most things don't eat grasses. So, and tried prunella, no. Well, we have prunella vulgaris that spontaneously is growing our in our native lawn, in and among the spontaneous non-native species. So I'm not sure if that's the prunella that the question that was referring to or not. But yes, we have it growing spontaneously, and we don't control it, but it's collected, and collectively the other species are still under 15%.
We have a question. When you mow the native lawn, do you just leave the trimmings on the lawn?
Yes.
And then I heard a suggestion that if you're using cardboard to cover the ground for 5 weeks, uncover for 2 to let seed bank sprout, cover again for 5 weeks, and repeat a few times. This helps to get rid of the seed bank.
That's an interesting idea. I could see how that could work and be better than a one-off. Thanks.
Maybe you need a 5th or a 4th
Yeah,
section here.
yeah. Although I have to say, so I didn't talk about scale, but each of our trials is 2,500 square feet. So each of these was intended to be more or less one person's lawn. And then we're doing it times 3. So 2,500 square feet of cardboard would be a bit challenging to make sure you keep it all in place. So as it is now, it's one uniform piece of fabric that we then landscape staple onto the land, just for economy of scale. But for your local homeowner, I could definitely see how that could be very, very easy and successful.
Maria, did you re-raise your hand, or is it?
Yeah, do you have a jumping worm problem issue?
Yes, but they don't prefer the sandy soil the same as our other really organic soils that are in the forest. But yes, we have 11 species of non-native worms in our natural area, and that includes jumping worms. But what I would say is many of the areas in Massachusetts would lend themselves to the same soil conditions that we think are optimal in our native lawn. All the granites and everything that are in Massachusetts create this granitic sand, and that kind of landscape is ideal. The lower the pH, the better. The species that we're talking about do very well in lower pH areas. Lower pH limits the nutrients that other plants are able to take up as well, and so then it disadvantages the non-native species, and the jumping worms don't like well-drained sandy soils like they like high rich organic soils. So those could be things that could be considerations in dealing with how you might establish native lawns or just native plants in general in areas with jumping worms.
Well, Todd, thank you so much. This hour flew by. I really appreciate you coming to talk to us, and we would love to hear how this next trial goes. Maybe we can have you back. And what do you think? Do you think you'll have information in about a year, or are you?
Yeah, year and a half.
All right.
That sounds nice.
We've penciled you in.
Okay.
Thank you so much. And
My
thanks, everybody.
pleasure.
Remember, we do not have an August meeting, but we will see you in September. Good night.
Night.